There is a name that was spoken in whispers across 3 plantations, 2 county estates, and at least 1 church vestry meeting where the reverend believed no one was taking notes. The name was Solomon. Not because Solomon had done something violent. Not because Solomon had run. Not because Solomon had broken a single rule in the 6 years he had lived and worked on the Caldwell estate. But because of something far more dangerous. Far more difficult to punish. Far more impossible to explain in a courtroom or a ledger or any of the official places where the world of that time tried to record what it could not understand. Solomon made the women of the planter class forget themselves. Not all at once. Not loudly. Not in ways that could be easily named or brought before a magistrate or written into the kind of testimony that men in authority would have known how to process. But slowly. Quietly. The way water finds the crack in stone and works it wider over years without the stone ever hearing it coming. And what made Solomon truly extraordinary, what separated his story from every other story of forbidden desire and plantation danger that the elders whispered about long after the events had passed, was this single devastating fact. Solomon knew exactly what he was doing. He had known for 3 years. And he was using every single second of it. This is not a story about a man who was desired. This is a story about a man who understood desire and turned it into the most powerful weapon available to a man who legally owned nothing, not even his own name. Stay with us. This is going to take some time, and every minute of it is going to be worth it. Welcome to Unmarked History, the place where buried history finally gets to speak. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into history's untold stories. Let's go. Georgetown District, South Carolina, sat in the Low Country, that particular stretch of coastal land where the air carried salt and rot in equal measure, where the rivers ran dark with tannin, and where the rice plantations had made a small number of white families almost incomprehensibly wealthy on the labor of thousands of enslaved people who had been brought across the Atlantic specifically because they already knew how to grow rice. The Gullah people of the South Carolina Low Country had not been randomly selected for that crossing. They had been hunted for their knowledge. The rice planters of Georgetown had studied the slave trade with the precision of men who understood that the particular skill of cultivating rice in tidal conditions, the flooding, the draining, the timing, the reading of water and soil and seasonal shift, was not something that could be taught quickly to men who did not carry it in their hands. It existed in specific communities along the rice coast of West Africa, in the bodies and the memory of people who had been doing it for generations, in knowledge so embedded in the daily life of those communities that it was not even understood as special knowledge. It was simply what people knew. So the traders went to those communities, and they took those people, and they brought them to South Carolina, and the planters got rich. And the people they had taken, the people who had carried their knowledge in their hands across the ocean in chains, built an entire agricultural empire for men who could not have built it without them. Solomon's grandmother had been one of those people. Her name in the Caldwell estate records was simply Nora. The records did not preserve what her name had been before the records. They did not record where on the rice coast she had come from, what language she had spoken first, what she had understood about rivers and seasons and the movement of water across soil before the world was reorganized around her without her consent. But Solomon knew some of it, because Nora had told his mother, and his mother had told him. In fragments, in the dark, in the low and careful voices that enslaved people used when they were passing the things that mattered most from one generation to the next. Not in documents, not in anything that could be confiscated or burned or used as evidence, but in breath, in memory, in the patient architecture of story told across years. Solomon had been born in 1806 on the Caldwell estate, on a night in July when the heat sat on the Low Country like a hand pressed flat against the land. He had been born to a woman named Iris, who was the daughter of Nora, who had survived the Middle Passage and arrived on this shore and had spent the rest of her long life doing something that the system around her was entirely designed to prevent. She had remained, completely and without apology, herself. Iris gave her son 3 things before he was old enough to fully understand what she was giving him. She gave him her mother's stories, the fragments of before, the knowledge that he came from people who had built things, understood things, held knowledge in their hands that the people who now owned him did not possess and could not manufacture and could not take regardless of what else they managed to take. She gave him her own observation about the world he had been born into, that it was, at its foundation, a performance. That the white families who ruled it were not as powerful as they appeared. That what they had was authority, which was a thing that could be granted by law and revoked by circumstance. That power was something different. That power had to be built, quietly, from the inside, over time, from materials that no one was watching closely enough to notice being assembled. And she gave him, most dangerously, most deliberately, most lovingly, the ability to read. Not taught in a single stolen season of secret lessons. Taught across years, slowly, in layers, in the same darkness where she passed him everything else that mattered. By the time Solomon was 14, he could read anything placed in front of him. By the time he was 18, he had read property law. By the time he was 20, he understood the Caldwell estate, its debts, its arrangements, its vulnerabilities, better than several of the men who ran it. He understood which neighboring landowners the colonel trusted and which he feared. He understood, from discarded correspondence and overheard conversations and the quiet accumulation of years of watching powerful men speak freely in front of a man they believed could not comprehend them, exactly what held this world together. It ran on information. And Solomon had more of it than anyone around him knew. Now we must talk about what he looked like. Because in this story, what Solomon looked like is not a minor detail. It is the engine of everything that follows. He was, by any measure, remarkable in appearance. Not beautiful in the soft or passive sense. Solomon was striking in the way that certain men are striking. The kind of presence that makes a room recalibrate without quite knowing why. He stood at just over 6 feet, lean and proportioned in the way that comes from years of physical labor that has built the body rather than broken it. His face was angular and precise, with eyes that held a quality that the women of the planter class would later struggle to describe in their private correspondence. The word they reached for most often was intelligent, though what they meant was something closer to present. He looked at you in a way that made you feel you were being fully seen and fully understood at the same time. For women who had spent years being barely noticed by the men who shared their homes and their dinner tables, that quality of attention was almost unbearably powerful. Solomon understood this. He had understood it since he was 19 years old, when the first woman, a visiting cousin of the mistress, 28, recently widowed, staying at the estate for 2 weeks, had looked at him across the width of a garden path with an expression that told him, with the clarity of something written plainly, everything he needed to know about what was possible. He had filed that information carefully. He had not acted on it. He was 19 years old. He was watching. He was learning. He was beginning, in the patient way his grandmother had modeled across 6 decades of survival, to build something that would take time. He could wait. The Caldwell estate covered 1,100 acres of low country terrain, cotton and rice, and a sawmill at the eastern edge that the colonel had added in 1818 when the timber prices made it worth the investment. The main house had been built in 1801 and added to in every decade since, each addition a declaration of prosperity that Colonel Harlan Caldwell felt compelled to make visible to a county that was watching. Colonel Harlan Caldwell was 53 years old in the summer of 1829. A large, deliberate man who had inherited this estate from his father and had spent his adult life expanding it with the focused energy of someone for whom more was always, without question, the only acceptable direction. He was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He did not take pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. He was a man who had been born into a system and had never in his life been required to seriously examine it, and so he hadn't. He was practical, unsentimental, and entirely convinced of his own fundamental decency, which made him, in certain ways, more dangerous than men who understood themselves clearly. He had a wife, a daughter, and a guest who had arrived 6 weeks ago and showed no particular signs of leaving. Margaret Caldwell was 44. She had come to this estate at 21 as a new bride and had spent the following 23 years constructing a life inside walls that were very comfortable and entirely airless. She was the kind of woman who had organized her interior life so thoroughly and so carefully that almost nothing showed on the surface at any time. Intelligent, controlled, and elegant in the specific way of someone who has made elegance into a discipline rather than a pleasure. She had not been touched with genuine tenderness in more years than she found it useful to count. She had first noticed Solomon 14 months ago. Not dramatically. Not with the suddenness that stories sometimes assign to these moments. She had noticed him the way you notice the quality of light changing in a room, gradually, with awareness arriving slowly, and then with the recognition that it had been changing for some time before you registered it consciously. He had been repairing the stone steps of the back porch. She had been reading in the garden. He had spoken to Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, about the width of a replacement board, and his voice had carried across the garden with a particular clarity and precision that made her look up from her page without quite deciding to. He had not been looking at her. He had been looking at the wood. And something about that, the quality of his concentration, the completeness of his absorption in the task his hands were performing, had landed in her chest with a weight she had not expected and could not immediately name. She had returned to her book. She did not think about it again for 3 days. Then she thought about it. Then she thought about it again. And after that she thought about it with an increasing frequency that disturbed her, which was why she had spent the following 14 months engaged in a sustained private war with herself that had produced, as its primary observable outcome, an ever-lengthening list of minor repairs she needed the carpenter to attend to in and around the main house. The daughter's name was Charlotte. Charlotte Caldwell was 21, and she was her father's daughter in one specific way. She was focused, direct, and entirely disinclined toward the decorative conventions of the life she had been born into. She read too much for the comfort of men who had expressed interest in her, which had so far produced 3 dissolved engagements and a reputation across Georgetown County for being difficult to manage. She was not difficult to manage. She was simply not performing anything for anyone, which in the world she occupied amounted to the same thing. Charlotte had noticed Solomon more recently than her mother, and more suddenly, the way certain kinds of perception work in young people who have not yet learned to dilute their own awareness. She had come around the corner of the stable yard 4 months ago and found him repairing a stall, and the sight of him had stopped her physically, mid-step, before she had consciously processed what her feet were responding to. She was a woman who trusted her own intelligence entirely. This response she could not entirely explain, which bothered her, which meant she had begun, in the systematic way she approached everything that bothered her, to try to understand it. Which meant watching him. Which she told herself was analytical. The guest was a woman named Vera Ashford. Vera was 36, the wife of a tobacco planter from North Carolina, sent to convalesce at the home of her old friend Margaret Caldwell after an illness earlier in the year. The illness had long since passed. Vera was, by any reasonable medical judgment, fully recovered. She had not left because the Caldwell estate was significantly more interesting than her own home, and because Vera, who had inherited a sharp intelligence from her mother and a talent for strategic patience from no one she could name, had sensed, in her first week here, that something interesting was happening on this property. She had identified Solomon immediately. Not with the gradual accumulation of Margaret, not with the sudden full arrival of Charlotte. With the particular efficiency of a woman who had spent years reading rooms and situations with the focused attention that boredom and intelligence produce in combination. She had said something to Margaret about him in her second week, casually as a test, and Margaret had deflected with such controlled precision that Vera had understood 2 things simultaneously. 1. She was not the only woman in this house who had noticed. 2. Margaret's level of control over this subject meant the noticing had been going on for some time. Vera had smiled at the deflection. She enjoyed a situation that had layers. She was good at finding them. She had no intention, once she had found one, of leaving it alone. These were the 3 women. And Solomon, who had been observing all 3 of them for months with the patient and unhurried attention of a man who had understood since he was 14 years old that watching carefully was itself a form of power, had arrived at a conclusion that had reorganized everything. Each of them wanted something from him. And each of them had something he needed. The question was not whether to use this. The question was how. In what sequence. With what care. And how to prevent them from becoming aware of each other, or aware of him, before the plan he had been building for 2 years reached the moment of its completion. Let us be clear about what Solomon was doing. because this story can be misread by people who are looking for something simpler than what it is. And we will not let it be misread. Solomon was not pursuing pleasure. He was not reckless. He was not operating from desire in any ordinary sense of that word. He was a man who had read property law, who understood, with the precision that comes from years of careful study, exactly what his legal status was worth and exactly what it would take to change it, who had spent 6 years on the Caldwell estate accumulating the specific practical knowledge that would make change possible. He had a plan. The plan had 3 requirements. The first requirement was access to the colonel's private study, specifically to a set of correspondence that Solomon had reason to believe, based on fragments he had managed to read while completing repairs in the room, and on conversations he had heard through the particular invisibility that enslaved workers were afforded in the presence of men who believed they couldn't be understood, contained information about a business arrangement between the colonel and a man named Drayton. Information that the colonel would not want examined by anyone with the authority to examine it. Not criminal exactly, but the kind of arrangement that powerful men depend, absolutely, on remaining quiet. He needed to read those letters in full. He needed time alone in that study. Neither of those things was possible for a field carpenter under ordinary circumstances, but they might be possible through Margaret. The second requirement was a specific document from the Georgetown County Land Records Office. A document that would take a free person half a day to retrieve, and that Solomon, who could not walk into that building, needed someone else to go and find. Someone with enough social freedom to make the trip, and enough personal reason to want to be useful to him. That was Vera. The third requirement was money. Not a large sum, but a specific amount. Enough to pay a passage north on a trading vessel out of Charleston, to a man in Philadelphia who had been known to employ formerly enslaved skilled craftsmen and who had, on several documented occasions, filed papers of manumission for men he employed once a specific period of compensated labor had been completed. The passage needed to be arranged through someone with connections to the trading network out of Charleston. Vera again. Or possibly Charlotte, though Solomon had not yet determined Charlotte's role. These were the 3 requirements. And here is the thing that must be understood about how Solomon intended to meet them. He was not going to lie to these women. Not in the direct sense. He was not going to fabricate feelings he didn't have or perform an intimacy that was entirely hollow. What he was going to do was something more sophisticated and more honest and, in certain ways, more dangerous than simple deception. He was going to let them see the parts of him that were real. Because the parts of Solomon that were real, his intelligence, his depth of perception, his quality of attention, the full and complete way he engaged with the world around him, those were genuinely rare things. Things these women had not encountered in the confined and performance-saturated lives they were living. And Solomon knew that the most powerful thing he could offer any of them was not a pretense. It was the experience of being truly and completely seen by someone who had every reason in the world to be looking at something else. He would give them that. In doing so, he would build the trust that opened the doors he needed opened. Was this manipulation? Yes. Was it simple? No. It was the action of a man with no legal standing, no safe avenue of protest, no court that would hear him, no authority he could appeal to, using the only resource that the system around him had not found a way to take. His mind. His patience. His deep and practiced understanding of the human need to be witnessed. He was doing what Nora had survived the ocean to give him the foundation to do. He was doing what Iris had taught him in the dark to be capable of doing. He was using what he had. And he was going to walk out of this place. The first door was Margaret Caldwell. Solomon had understood for 8 months that Margaret was the most powerful resource in the house and also the most carefully managed. She was not going to respond to anything that felt calculated. She was not going to be rushed or pressed or flattered into anything. She had spent 23 years developing an extremely finely tuned instrument for detecting performance in other people, because a woman in her position had to, because performance was the only currency in circulation in the social world she occupied, and the ability to distinguish it from the real thing had been, for her, a matter of something close to survival. If Solomon was performing for her, she would feel it. And she would close completely. So Solomon did something that, in the context of this plantation and this world, was genuinely radical. He was simply himself. Not the reduced version of himself that the system required and enforced. Not the version that answered in 3 words and moved through space as though apologizing for the fact of his own existence. The real version. The full one. When Margaret paused near the garden one morning to ask him about the repair he was doing to the stone edging, a genuine question he could tell immediately because Margaret had a particular quality of focus when she was actually curious, he answered her in full. He told her about the limestone composition of the particular stone, about how the drainage situation on that side of the garden was the actual cause of the frost damage she had been seeing every spring, about what a proper long-term repair would require versus what a quick surface fix would accomplish and how long it would hold. He spoke to her the way a skilled man speaks to someone he considers worth speaking to fully. Not with deference. Not with the particular diminishment that the world around him required. With the calm confidence of a craftsman explaining his work to a person whose comprehension he respects. Margaret had gone very still. Not with discomfort or alarm. With the specific quality of stillness that comes over a person who has just received something they did not know they had been waiting for. She asked another question. He answered it. She came back the following morning with a question about a different section of the garden. The week after that, a question about the timber framing in the back corridor. The week after that, something about the stone foundation on the north side of the house that had been a concern since the rains. Solomon answered every question with the same quality of full and unhurried presence. He never crossed a line. Never held a look too long. Never said anything that could be named or repeated in a way that would cause either of them damage. But he gave her the complete weight of his attention every time. He made her feel, consistently and without performance, that what she had observed and what she had asked genuinely mattered. That she was worth a real answer. That she was worth engaging with seriously. Within 3 months, Margaret Caldwell had done something she could not have predicted. She had begun to confide in him. Small things at first. The difficulty of managing the household schedule when the Colonel was traveling. The frustration of a piece of correspondence that had gone unanswered. The problem with the South Garden that nobody was managing properly. The kind of things that had no other outlet in her life. No person she could say them to without social consequence. No space where they could be expressed without being managed or dismissed. Solomon listened. And because he listened the way he did, without judgment, without the hollow performing sympathy that people produce when they want to appear caring, but with genuine and sustained attention, Margaret began to talk more. And the more she talked, the more he understood. He learned the Colonel's schedule in detail. When he left for the sawmill. When he was expected at county meetings. Which mornings he worked in the study and which mornings he was elsewhere on the property. He learned which domestic workers had access to which parts of the house. He learned, most importantly, about the connecting door. The door between Margaret's sitting room and the Colonel's study, which Margaret had legal access to when the Colonel was away, for the purpose of retrieving household ledgers. A door that connected to the room that held the Drayton correspondence. A door that Margaret held a key to. Solomon filed every piece of this. He continued being himself. Continued giving Margaret what she had never had enough of. Continued building, slowly and with extraordinary patience, the trust that would eventually open that door. And one Tuesday in early November, when the Colonel had left at 7 for the sawmill and would not return before 3 in the afternoon, Margaret sent Mrs. Drummond across the yard with a message that there was a problem with the sitting room shelving that required immediate attention. Solomon walked to the main house. He repaired the shelving, which had no visible problem that he could identify, which told him something, and while Margaret stood near the window looking out at the garden and talking, in her careful and unhurried way, about a letter from her sister that had arrived that morning, Solomon's eyes moved, with the practiced subtlety of a man who had spent years seeing things without appearing to see them, to the connecting door on the far wall. It was unlocked. The Colonel was at the sawmill. The house was quiet. He had what he needed. Now he needed the moment. And the moment, he understood, would come when Margaret trusted him enough to leave him alone in that room. He was 3 weeks away from that. He could feel it. He picked up his tools. He thanked her for her time. He walked back across the yard. Vera Ashford had been watching Solomon watch Margaret for 6 weeks before she decided to do something about it. She was not offended by what she saw. She was intrigued. Vera had a particular quality of perception that comes from moving through a social world that requires women to be decorative and agreeable on the surface while simultaneously expecting them to manage everything beneath it. Which meant, if you were paying the right kind of attention, that you learn to read people the way experienced travelers read weather. From small signs. From the inconsistencies. From the things that didn't quite match the surface. And what Vera saw when she watched Solomon near Margaret did not match. He was too still. Too precise. The attention he gave Margaret was clearly real. She had enough experience reading false attention to recognize the genuine article, but it had a quality beneath it. A purposefulness that was not simply affection or attraction. She had seen enough men in enough situations to understand the difference between a man who was helplessly drawn toward something and a man who had made a considered decision to move toward it. Solomon had decided. This interested her completely. She engineered their first real conversation at the eastern fence on a morning when she had gone for her preferred solitary walk and found him repairing a section of post rail that the autumn storms had worked loose. She did not pretend she needed something. That was not Vera's method. She stopped. She looked at him directly. She said, "You are very good at what you do." The emphasis made clear she was not talking about the fence. Solomon set down his tool. He looked at her with the same quality of direct assessment she was giving him. Not defensively. Not with the careful performance of a man afraid of the attention. With the stillness of a person who has been accurately perceived and is deciding what to do with that fact. And then, briefly, controlled but unmistakably real, he smiled. Vera had expected to have the advantage in this conversation. She walked back to the house afterward, not entirely certain she had. Solomon watched her go. He had added a significant complication to his assessment of her. She was intelligent in the particular way that made her simultaneously more useful and more dangerous than he had originally calculated. She was not going to be managed the way Margaret could be managed, through depth of presence and the slow construction of trust. Vera didn't need presence. She needed something that matched her own level of precision. She needed to win something. That was what she was looking for. A match. The question was what he could let her win that advanced the plan without exposing it. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he offered her a secret. Not his real secret. Never that. But a small and genuinely useful piece of intelligence. Information about a boundary dispute between the colonel and a neighboring landowner, a disagreement that had been running quietly for 2 years, that Vera had practical use for because she and her husband were considering the purchase of adjacent property, and the outcome of that dispute would directly affect the value of what they were considering buying. He gave it to her in 2 sentences at the fence in a low voice, while appearing to discuss a board measurement. Vera received it without changing her expression. She walked away without indicating it mattered. 2 days later, she passed the workshop doorway in the late morning and leaned briefly against the frame and said, without looking at him, that she intended to ride to Georgetown the following week and would be passing the county records office. She said it in a voice that was perfectly ordinary. She walked on without waiting for a response. Solomon did not move for a long moment. He understood exactly what had just been offered. He went back to work. The second requirement of the plan had just become possible. Charlotte Caldwell was not supposed to be part of the plan. Solomon had assessed her with the same care he gave everything, and had reached a conclusion that drove him toward distance rather than engagement. Charlotte was, of his 3 primary concerns on this estate, the most dangerous. Not because she was reckless. Because she was the precise opposite of reckless. Charlotte thought carefully. Charlotte noticed things and then noticed the things behind the things. Charlotte had a quality of systematic, layered observation that reminded Solomon, in the uncomfortable way that recognition between similar minds can be uncomfortable, of himself. 2 people using the same cognitive tools in the same environment creates a specific kind of risk. She might see what he was doing. He had therefore maintained, with Charlotte, a careful professional distance. Short answers. Respectful but limited engagement. He gave her none of the full presence he gave Margaret and none of the transactional precision he had extended to Vera. He kept Charlotte at a distance. Charlotte noticed. This, of course, was the miscalculation. The one he hadn't accounted for. Because Charlotte Caldwell was precisely the kind of person who registered the absence of something she had not consciously realized she wanted more sharply than its presence would have registered. She had spent 21 years in a world where men gave her either the performance of polite attention or the calculating assessment of a woman with marriage prospects. She had never once been given the experience of simply being treated as what she actually was, a mind worth engaging. She had watched Solomon give that to everyone around her. Everyone except her. And the specific, pointed nature of that omission had begun to feel like a statement. She came to the workshop on a morning in December, directly, without pretense, which was the only way Charlotte did anything. She stood in the doorway. She said, "May I watch you work?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "If you have the time for it." She came in and sat on a low stool near the wall and watched him in complete silence for 20 minutes. He worked. She watched. Neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "You think in front of the wood." He glanced at her. She said, "Most men with your level of skill would move faster. You pause before each cut. You're not hesitating. You're deciding something." He set down his tool. He looked at her, the first time he had given her the full direct look, and he said, "What do you think I'm deciding?" She said, "Whether it's the right cut. Not whether you can make it. You already know you can. Whether it's the right one." Something shifted in Solomon's calculations. This woman was not going to be managed by anything simple. She was also, he understood in that moment with uncomfortable clarity, the most genuinely honest person in the main house. Not performing honesty. Actually possessed of it as a natural condition. He picked up the tool. He said, "You're right." She stayed another hour. They talked about the wood, about the cabinet he was building for the Colonel's study, about the difference between furniture built to last and furniture built to look as though it will last. Solomon gave her what she had been waiting for without knowing she had been waiting for it. He treated her like a mind. Charlotte walked back to the house with a feeling she could not name and would not have named even if she could. Solomon watched her go and understood that he had made a decision he had not consciously made. He had included her. Not as a door. Not as a resource to be activated. Charlotte was going to be something else in this plan. Something he couldn't fully see yet. He went back to work. Here is something that must be understood about a contained world with limited space and amplified emotion. When multiple people are privately navigating the same territory without knowledge of each other, the pressure builds. It has nowhere to go. And the longer it has nowhere to go, the more dangerous it becomes. Not because any individual person intends danger, but because emotion under pressure finds its own release point regardless of anyone's intention. Through the autumn months of 1829, the atmosphere inside the Caldwell main house changed in ways that the domestic workers who moved through it every day registered before anyone could have articulated it. Rosa, the head housemaid, would describe it years later as a feeling of something held too tight for too long. Like a rope pulled from both ends by people who didn't know the other person was pulling. Margaret had become, in small and carefully managed ways, a slightly different version of herself. She walked through the house with more deliberateness. She arranged her days to include more time in the sitting room, which had a window that faced the yard. She had become quieter at dinner, though when she spoke with more precision than usual, as though she had been thinking carefully before allowing words to leave her. Vera had stopped talking about leaving. She made no formal announcement about extending her stay. She simply continued to be present, occupying her guest room and appearing at meals and on her walks, and no one directly questioned it because she was Margaret's guest and Margaret did not raise it. And Vera, in the evenings, had begun to study the architecture of the household with an attention that had a purpose in it. Charlotte had returned to the workshop twice since the December morning. Both times ostensibly for practical reasons. Once to ask about the progress on the study cabinet, once to ask a question about a repair to her bedroom window that she had been told would take 2 more weeks. Solomon answered both questions completely and treated her, both times, like the person she was. She left both times with the feeling that the conversation had contained something she was still processing. The Colonel noticed none of this. Harlan Caldwell moved through his household with the comfortable certainty of a man who believed his house was in order because he had given no instruction for it to be otherwise. He had the particular blindness of powerful men who have never had to read the rooms they move through because the rooms have always arranged themselves around their preferences. He did not see what was building, but it was building. And Solomon, who saw all of it, who had, for months, been the quiet center of a pressure system he had partly created and could not entirely control, understood that the architecture of the plan was entering its most delicate phase. He needed the study. He needed Vera's information from Georgetown. He needed time. And he needed, above everything, for the 3 women in that house to remain unaware of each other until he was ready to move. He did not know yet how little time he had left before that became impossible. Before we go further into Solomon's story, we want to stop for just one moment. Because if this is your first time finding unmarked history, you arrived at a good moment. This is what we do. We find the stories that history chose to put away, the ones too complex, too fully human, too dangerous to include in the simplified version of the past that most of us were handed, and we tell them in full, with all the weight and all the complexity and all the human reality intact. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe right now. Turn on the notification bell, because the next story after Solomon's is going to hit just as hard, and you don't want to come looking for it after it's already out. Drop a comment while you're here. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, what city, what country, what time it is where you are. We read every single one and we love knowing where these stories land. Now, back to Solomon. Because the next part of this story is the part where everything he has been building gets tested. And a woman with nothing to lose is about to do something that none of them will be able to take back. January 1830. The colonel left for Charleston on a Wednesday morning. He would be gone until Friday. Solomon had known about this trip for 2 weeks, because Margaret had mentioned it in passing during one of their conversations. As a domestic logistical detail, the way she had begun to mention the rhythms of her household to him without consciously deciding that she was doing so. He had also known, for 2 weeks, exactly what he needed from that study. The Drayton correspondence, the letters that dealt with the boundary transfer arrangement that Solomon had glimpsed enough of, during the shelf repair, to understand represented a vulnerability for the colonel that had never been formally resolved. He needed to read those letters in full, to hold their contents in his memory completely, not to take them, not to use them immediately, simply to have them, in the way that Iris had taught him that information was not about the using of it but about the having. The having was where the power lived. On Thursday morning, Margaret sent word through Mrs. Drummond that the sitting room shelving had developed a real problem. He was needed immediately. He came. He repaired the shelf with the care he gave everything. Margaret stood near the window and talked in her careful way about her sister's upcoming visit, which had been confirmed for February. The conversation moved in the unhurried way their conversations had developed. Spacious, with room for things that were not directly being said. At 11:15, Mrs. Drummond called Margaret to the kitchen for a matter involving the linen accounts. Margaret excused herself. She left the sitting room. The connecting door to the study was open. Solomon had 14 minutes. He crossed the sitting room. He entered the study. He went to the desk. He found the Drayton correspondence in the third drawer beneath a set of household accounts, in a leather folder with a brass clasp. He opened it. There were 4 letters. He read all 4 with the speed and completeness of a man who had been reading seriously since he was 11 years old and who had trained himself, across years of stolen minutes and carefully guarded candle stubs, to hold what he read the way a jar holds water. Every name, every date, every number, every specific and compromising particular of the arrangement between Harlan Caldwell and the man named Drayton went into that memory and was secured there. He did not take the letters. He returned them to the folder. He closed the clasp. He replaced the folder beneath the household accounts exactly as he had found it. He went back to the sitting room. He was working on the shelf when Margaret returned from the kitchen, still arranging her thoughts about the linen matter. She said, "I'm sorry that took longer than I expected." He said, "No trouble at all. I'm almost finished here." She stood at the window. She looked out at the winter garden. After a while she said quietly, "Do you ever think about what it would be like somewhere else?" Solomon considered the question with the weight it deserved. He said, "I think about what is possible." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the shelf. The silence lasted a long time. Then she said, "I think about that too." He picked up his tools. He said goodbye with a courtesy and restraint that he gave everything. He walked back across the yard. The first requirement was complete. February brought a cold week and Vera's return from Georgetown. She returned on a Tuesday and said nothing to Solomon for 3 days. On the 4th day she found him at the eastern fence. Their particular location, arrived at gradually, the threshold between the domestic interior of the estate and the working exterior of it, and she stood at the fence without preliminary and said, "The document was filed on the 14th of August, 1822. The second signature is listed as a witness, not a party to the transfer. And the seal used does not match the county register record for that year." Solomon absorbed this. He said, "You read it yourself." She said, "I had a reason to understand it." He said, "Thank you." Vera studied him for a moment. She said, "What are you building, Solomon?" The use of his name, direct, flat, without the title or the distance, was itself a statement. an acknowledgement of what they were actually doing in these fence conversations. He met her eyes. He said, "Something that takes time." She held the look. Then she said, "I'll be leaving at the end of March. There is a trading vessel out of Charleston in mid-April. The captain is a man named Forsyth. He owes my husband a favor, which means he owes me a favor by extension." She pushed off the fence. She walked toward the house without looking back. Solomon stood at the fence. He did not move for a long moment. He looked out across the low country fields, flat, dark-soiled, built on the knowledge that his grandmother had carried across the ocean in chains. The fields where his mother had bent her back since before he could form memories. The land that bore the name Caldwell on every legal document while bearing, in every productive acre of it, the knowledge and the labor and the lives of people whose names those documents had never thought to record. He breathed. He was not free yet. But freedom had just acquired a date. Charlotte could not sleep. She lay in her room on a night in late February and went through what she had seen at the dinner table 3 weeks ago with a methodical precision she brought to problems that required solving. Vera had made a comment. About the carpenter's work on the east fence. About the quality of intelligence evident in it. She had not finished the sentence. She had not needed to. Because Charlotte had watched her mother go still in a way that was not ordinary stillness, and had felt the particular quality of that moment, the specific charge in the air, the way no one at the table had filled the silence, and had understood, with the clarity that arrives sometimes like cold water all at once, what she was actually looking at. She was not angry. She was not jealous. She was frightened. And she understood, with her father's capacity for clear calculation, why. She got up. She wrapped her coat around her. She crossed the yard in the pre-dawn dark to the workshop. He was already awake. She found him at the workbench by a single candle, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him, at the concentration of him, the quality of stillness he had even when no one was watching. And then she crossed the workshop and sat on the stool and said, "Vera said something at dinner 3 weeks ago." He said, "I know what she said." She said, "My father will find out. Not from me. Not from Vera intentionally. But this kind of thing has weight. It moves through a household. It finds the person with the most authority to act on it. And my father, when he finds it, will not ask careful questions. He will act on the first interpretation available to him that protects his pride. And the interpretation that protects his pride is never the one that protects you." Solomon looked at her. She said, "How much time do you need?" He was still for a moment. She said, "I'm not asking to know what you're doing. I'm asking how much time." He said, 2 weeks. She nodded. She said, "I can give you 10 days. After 10 days I cannot predict what Vera does before she leaves. I cannot predict what my mother does with what she is carrying. I cannot predict when my father stops not asking the questions he hasn't asked yet." She stood. She was at the door when he said her name. "Charlotte." She turned. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him, the full, direct, completely unperformed look that was the most Charlotte thing about her, and she said, "Don't waste it." She walked back through the cold. Solomon sat with the candle and understood something that reorganized a small part of him. He had built the plan carefully. He had managed it precisely. He had given each woman exactly what she needed to become a piece of the architecture. But Charlotte was not a piece of the architecture. Charlotte had walked across a cold yard in the pre-dawn dark and given him 10 days because she had looked at what was being done to him and decided it was wrong, and she had the capacity to do something, and so she would. That was not strategy. That was not a door being opened by desire. That was a person choosing. He sat with that for a long time. Then he went back to work. The 10 days moved the way the days before something decisive always move, too slowly when you are in them and too fast when you look back. Solomon worked. He arrived each morning at the same hour, completed the same quality of work, moved through the estate with the same unhurried precision that had always characterized him. On the surface, completely unchanged. Beneath the surface, executing. On the second day he arranged, through the network of communication that moved across the estate through the invisible channels that enslaved people had built in the spaces white authority had never fully managed to monitor, through the kitchen talk and the workyard exchanges and the quiet messages carried in the pockets of people whose movement across the estate went unquestioned, for a message to reach a man named Henry who worked the Georgetown docks and who had been part of the literacy network for 3 years. The message confirmed the arrangement with Forsyth and the date of the April passage. Confirmation came back on the 4th day. On the 6th day Margaret sent for him. He came to the sitting room. Margaret was at the window. The room was arranged with a particular intentionality. Mrs. Drummond was absent from the household space, which was unusual for that hour. The colonel was at a county meeting. The house was quiet. Margaret talked in her careful way about February, about her sister's visit, about the spring planting, about things adjacent to what she actually wanted to say, which was her method. And then, after a silence that lasted long enough to have meaning, she said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about what is possible." He waited. She said, "I think I have spent a great many years believing that what was possible was determined by what was visible, by what already existed. I'm not certain I still believe that." He said very carefully, "What people believe is possible tends to change when their circumstances change." She understood exactly what he meant. She chose not to name it. She said, "Is there anything you need?" He told her. Not everything. Not the plan or the names or the date. But one specific, concrete thing, something that fit within the household authority she legitimately held, that moved one final piece into position. She listened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll arrange it." She looked at him one final time, with the full weight of everything she had felt for 14 months and would never say aloud, and she said, "I hope what you're building is worth it." He said, "So do I." March 1830. Vera left on a Thursday morning in the last week of the month. Margaret came down to see her off. Charlotte stood on the upper porch. The colonel shook her hand and wished her a safe journey back to North Carolina. Vera passed Solomon on her way to the carriage. She did not stop. She did not look at him directly. But as she passed, in a voice low enough to be heard only by the person walking closest to her, she said, "Forsyth knows to expect you." She got into the carriage. Solomon watched the carriage move down the Georgetown road until the trees closed behind it. Then he turned and went back to work. He had 11 days. April 9, 1830. 5 days before the passage. Solomon had arranged, through the formal channel of the overseer's work assignments, an appointment with Colonel Harlan Caldwell to discuss the completion and delivery of the study cabinet, the piece he had been building for 4 months, which was, by any objective measure, the finest piece of furniture he had ever made. This was intentional. He had made it extraordinary deliberately, because he understood that a man like Harlan Caldwell assessed the world through the quality of what it produced for him, and Solomon needed the colonel in a specific frame of mind for this conversation. He needed him satisfied. He needed him to have just confirmed, with his own eyes, that Solomon's value was real and significant and not easily replaced. He came to the study at 9 o'clock. The colonel was at his desk. He stood when Solomon brought the cabinet in, stood and walked around it, opened the drawers, tested the joints, examined the finish. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Good work." And the way he said it, with the particular flatness of a man who is genuinely pleased but not given to enthusiasm, told Solomon that the frame was right. He said, "Thank you, sir." He paused. He said, "I wanted to raise something while I had your time." The colonel looked at him. Solomon said, "There is a skilled arrangement in Philadelphia, a craftsman's position, the kind where a man of my trade could work toward his own papers over time." The connection came through Mrs. Ashford before she left. The colonel's expression did not change. He waited. Solomon said, "I believe you've had correspondence with a man named Drayton, regarding a matter of wetland boundary transfer, going back to 1822. I came across some information recently, in the course of work around the estate, that suggests that arrangement may have certain complications in the county records. A document filed August 14th. A witness signature that may not hold up to the kind of examination a county clerk would give it if someone brought it to his attention." He said it the way he said everything. Calmly. Without anger. Without threat in the voice. Just information being accurately described. The silence in the study was the kind of silence that has weight. Solomon said, "I have no interest in any of that. I have no interest in anything except what is possible for a man of my skills, working freely. I thought it was worth having an honest conversation about whether a proper arrangement, papers filed correctly, transfer recorded at fair value, might be worth more to both of us than the alternative." He did not name the alternative. He did not need to. Harlan Caldwell sat behind his desk for a long time. The morning light came through the study window and fell across the surface of the new cabinet and across the floor and across the space between the two men. Outside, the low country morning continued. Birds, a distant voice from the yard, the wind moving through the rice grass in the way it always moved. The colonel looked at Solomon. Solomon held it. without defiance, without submission, with the complete stillness of a man who has prepared for this moment for 2 years and has nothing in this room to fear. Finally, the colonel said, "You're asking me to sign your papers." Solomon said, "I'm asking you to consider what a clean, quiet arrangement is worth to a man in your position, compared to the conversation that exists as the alternative." Another silence. Harlan Caldwell was not a stupid man. He was a man who had never been required to be particularly wise, because power had always been available to substitute for wisdom. But he was not stupid. And he understood in this moment that the man standing on the other side of his own desk, in his own estate in a county where Caldwell's word had been law for a generation, had thought about this longer and more carefully than he had used the colonel's own household against him, had read his private correspondence, had built, quietly and over years, inside the very structure designed to prevent it, something that could not now be simply crushed. He picked up his pen. He left before the sun had fully cleared the tree-line, not running, not hiding, not slipping through a broken fence in the pre-dawn dark with his heart hammering and his breath caught and his body braced for the sound of dogs behind him. He walked to the gate of the Caldwell estate on the Georgetown Road. He had papers, legal papers, signed by Harlan Caldwell, witnessed by the estate overseer, dated April 12, 1830, in the formal language of a free labor arrangement that would be recorded in the county ledger as an entirely ordinary transaction. He carried them in the pocket of a coat that had been left, folded and clean, on the workbench of his workshop 2 days prior, with no note attached. He knew who had left it. He did not need a note. He walked through the gate. He did not look back at the house. He did not allow himself yet to feel the full weight of what this morning was. Because the road between Georgetown District and Charleston was 30 miles and he had not yet walked it, and freedom that is interrupted before it is complete is not yet freedom. He had learned this from people who had survived things he had not yet been required to survive. He walked. He thought about Nora, about a woman who had crossed the widest ocean in the world in chains and arrived on a shore that was not hers and had spent the rest of her life being, completely and without apology, exactly who she had always been, who had never allowed the system around her to determine what she understood about herself. He thought about Iris, about a woman who had taught him to read in the dark, in a voice so quiet it was barely breath, because she had understood with perfect clarity that the knowledge in his mind was the one thing that could not be inventoried or valued or transferred or taken, who had given him everything she had to give him and had known, when she gave it, what she was preparing him for. He thought about Celia, the old woman in the quarters who had watched everything across 40 years and said very little and had helped him, in ways that would never be in any record, to build what he had built. He had not been able to say goodbye to her. That sat in his chest with a particular weight. He thought about Charlotte Caldwell, who had walked across a cold yard in the pre-dawn dark and given him 10 days without asking what he was going to do with them, who had made a choice based on nothing except her own clear-eyed sense of what was right and what she had the capacity to do about it. He thought about all of it. He thought about the years of it, the patience, the precision, the daily execution of the plan while also doing the work, also repairing the fences and building the cabinets and answering the questions and being, simultaneously and without confusion, both the man the plantation saw and the man that Iris had made. He was not certain, on that April morning, that he had handled every part of it correctly. He was not certain that using the feelings of women who had genuine humanity in them, regardless of what their world had made them, regardless of what their comfort had been built on, could be described as clean. He carried that. He did not put it down. He simply also kept walking. At the edge of the first long tree line, where the road curved and the Caldwell estate disappeared from sight behind the curve of the land, Solomon stopped. He stood in the road. The low country morning was fully risen now. The light was flat and gold and carried the smell of the salt water from somewhere east and distant. The moss on the trees moved slowly in the early air. A bird called from somewhere above him and fell quiet. He stood in it. He felt it, all of it, the full crushing and expansive weight of the moment, the fear that hadn't left yet and the grief that wouldn't leave for some time and the loss and the love and the relief and the particular devastating sweetness of a survival that had been built rather than granted. He breathed it. Then he straightened. Charleston was 30 miles. The Forsyth vessel left on the morning tide. He had time. But only if he kept moving. He walked. The Caldwell estate ledger for April 1830 shows a labor transfer, recorded by the overseer on the 12th of the month. A carpenter, skilled grade, transferred to a private arrangement in the city. Value assessed at fair market for his trade. No name of the receiving party in the city. No further notation. That is all the record contains. The record does not contain what Harlan Caldwell felt, sitting alone in his study on the evening of April 9th after a conversation that had just redefined his understanding of what had been living in his own household. It does not contain what Margaret Caldwell felt, standing at the sitting room window on the morning of the 14th, looking out at the yard where the workshop stood empty. It does not contain what Charlotte felt, alone at her desk, with the knowledge of what she had chosen and the knowledge that she would never know how the story ended. It does not contain the names of the people who had built, across years, the invisible network of communication and information and mutual protection that had made Solomon's plan possible. Rosa, Celia, Henry at the Georgetown docks. The others whose names are not in any record because the record was never built to hold them. And it does not contain Solomon. Because 3 days after the transfer was recorded, the word reached the quarters through the channels that the quarters used, quietly, carefully, in the way that mattered, that the carpenter had not arrived at the city address he was supposed to reach. That inquiries had turned up nothing. That no one on any road between Georgetown and Charleston had reported seeing him. He had disappeared. The men the colonel sent to look found nothing. Nothing on the road north. Nothing at the docks. Nothing anywhere. Solomon was presumed dead. On the Caldwell estate, in the quarters where he had been born and had grown up and had quietly become something that no one around him had fully understood, the people who had known him received this information with the stillness of people who have learned that some things are better held without expression. They did not grieve loudly. They sat with it. And some of them, the ones who had been closest to the architecture of what he had built, the ones who had passed the messages and kept the secrets and made the small choices that the plan had depended on, some of them did not believe, in the private interior of themselves, that presumed dead and actually dead were the same thing. They believed there was a difference. And they believed that the difference in this particular case was the whole point. We are going to stop here. Not because the story is over. Because the part that comes next requires its own time. Its own space. Its own telling. Solomon did not die on the road between Georgetown District and Charleston. He disappeared. And there is a difference between those two things that will change everything you think you understood about this story. Because what Solomon built, not just the plan, not just the escape, but what he built on the other side of that road with the things he had carried out of the Caldwell estate in his mind and in his hands, that is a story that belongs in part 2. And part 2 is coming. Before then, we need something from you. If Solomon's story moved you tonight, if his patience, his precision, his refusal to be made smaller by a world that was built to make him smaller landed somewhere in you, tell us. Drop a comment. Tell us the moment that got you. Was it the workshop? The study? The fence conversations? The morning he walked out? Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what time it is where you are. Because this community, the people who find stories like this one and sit with them and share them and send them to people they love, you are the reason these stories get told. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this if someone you know needs to hear it. And come back for part 2. Because Solomon is not finished. He was never finished. He was only, on that April morning on a low country road with 30 miles ahead of him and the whole world beyond that, beginning. We'll see you then.